She was the most photographed woman in the British Empire. She was the bride who married the most beautiful man in the English-speaking world. She was Scarlett O'Hara, the actress who won 2 Academy Awards before she was 40, and who lived inside a 15th-century abbey filled with roses. And her only daughter wrote letters from a boarding school in Switzerland, begging, politely, carefully, in the language of a child who has been trained not to ask for too much, just to see her face. The letters were forwarded unanswered to the child's father. Her mother, Vivien Leigh, called them sweet and funny. Tonight we teach you the story of Suzanne Farrington. The daughter of one of the most famous actresses of the 20th century, the only child Vivien Leigh would ever raise to adulthood, and the woman who spent the last 50 years of her life refusing, quietly, firmly, and without exception, to speak publicly about the mother who gave birth to her. You will learn what Vivien wrote about her newborn baby, in a private letter that should have stayed buried. You will learn what a Catholic Mother Superior in Vancouver told a 7-year-old girl after newspapers reported her mother's elopement. You will learn what happened on a soundstage in Sri Lanka in 1953. The day Vivien Leigh broke so completely that a private aircraft had to be chartered to carry her, sedated, back to England. And you will learn why a daughter, given every reason to write a tell-all book, chose silence instead, and what that silence cost her, and what it preserved. You think you know Vivien Leigh. You don't know Suzanne. But first, who was Vivien Leigh, before the cameras decided what she would be? Vivien Mary Hartley was born on November 5, 1913, in Darjeeling, India. 6,000 feet above sea level, in a hill station where the British Empire sent its families to escape the heat of the plains. Her father, Ernest Hartley, was a stockbroker working in Calcutta. Her mother, Gertrude Yakji, was a woman of mixed Irish and Parsi heritage whose Catholicism would shape every decision made about her daughter's upbringing. The household was prosperous, peripatetic, and emotionally distant in the specific way that colonial households of that era often were. Children raised partially by servants, partially by boarding schools, partially by the rotating cast of adults who passed through them. Vivien was beautiful from the moment she could be photographed, even in the earliest images that survive. A child of 3, perhaps 4, dressed in white lace on the veranda of a colonial bungalow. There is something in her face that interrupts the eye. Wide-set blue-green eyes, a composure beyond her age. The watchfulness of a child who has already learned that beauty is currency, and that currency requires careful management. At 6 years old, she was sent to England, alone. Her mother enrolled her at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Roehampton, a boarding school for Catholic girls just outside London. Her parents stayed in India. The separation lasted, with brief interruptions, for the rest of her childhood. The 7-year-old who learned to sleep alone in a dormitory of strangers became, in measurable ways, the woman who would later struggle to form the steady, undramatic bonds that most adults take for granted. She met her closest school friend in that convent. The friend's name was Maureen O'Sullivan. Yes, the future star of the Tarzan films. Vivien told Maureen at the age of 7 that she intended to become a great actress. She had decided this before she lost her milk teeth. By the time she was a teenager, she had moved through finishing schools in Paris, Dinard, San Remo, and Salzburg, collecting languages, social graces, and a polished European veneer that would later set her apart in the British acting world. She returned to England in 1931. She enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. She had a plan, and the plan had been in place for 14 years. She was 18 years old when she met a young barrister named Herbert Lee Holman. He was 13 years older than she was. Dignified, a man of measured opinions and absolute reliability. The kind of man her family approved of without reservation. They were married on December 20th, 1932. Vivien was 19. 10 months later, she became a mother. Suzanne Mary Holman was born in a London nursing home on October 12, 1933. Vivien was not yet 20 years old. The pregnancy had interrupted her acting studies at RADA, and the interruption felt, to her, like an emergency she had not signed up for. In a private letter to a friend, written shortly after the birth, she described her newborn daughter in language that would later make biographers wince. The spinster Holman is minute, and does not allow anyone to be very proud of her yet. I have produced such a small-size infant that I shall have to feed it for months. The thought is too depressing. The thought is too depressing. These are the words a young woman used about her own infant child. Words she did not intend the world to read. Words that survived only because letters are stubborn objects that outlive the people who write them. Within months of Suzanne's birth, Vivien had hired a nanny, returned to her acting ambitions, and begun the systematic work of becoming someone other than a wife and mother. She wrote later, with the self-awareness she would bring to every difficult subject. I loved my baby as every mother does, but with the clear-cut sincerity of youth I realized that I could not abandon all thought of a career on the stage. A series of nannies took over. The most important of them was a French maid named Daisy Gogol, who arrived in May 1935, and would remain close to Suzanne for the rest of her life, a more consistent maternal presence, in the practical sense, than Vivien ever managed to be. In 1935, Vivien took the stage in a play called The Mask of Virtue. She had been working steadily toward this moment for 2 years. The play opened in London. The reviews the next morning made her famous overnight. The newspapers called her the Fame in a Night Girl, and the studio offers began arriving the same week. By 1937, she had met Laurence Olivier on the set of a film called Fire Over England. He was married. She was married. Their marriages did not survive the encounter. The affair was electric, mutual, and, for both of them, the central organizing event of their lives. By 1939, Vivien was Scarlett O'Hara, producer David O. Selznick had cast her in Gone with the Wind, against a field of every major actress in Hollywood. The film opened in December 1939. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Suzanne was 6 years old. Her mother was the most famous woman in the world, and her mother had, by this point, eloped. For 3 years, between 1939 and 1942, Vivien Leigh existed at a level of cultural saturation that almost no other actress of her generation matched. The Oscar. The marriage to Laurence Olivier in 1940, finalized after both of their first marriages were dissolved. The move into Notley Abbey, a 15th-century Buckinghamshire estate, where the most famous theatrical couple in the English-speaking world hosted the most famous theatrical guests in the English-speaking world. Photographs from this period show a woman who appears to have been issued an additional spotlight that follows her into rooms. She and Olivier were not simply a couple. They were a phenomenon. Time magazine put them on its cover. Newsreels documented their arrivals at premieres. Their love letters, passionate, possessive, intelligent, occasionally unhinged, would later be excerpted in books and quoted at length in documentaries. And Suzanne, during these years, was not at Notley Abbey. She was with her father, the quiet barrister Lee Holman, who had absorbed the dissolution of his marriage with the same dignity he brought to everything else, and who was raising his daughter with the steady intensity was constitutionally incapable of providing. When the war came, Suzanne was sent to Vancouver, Canada, with her grandmother Gertrude. She was 7 years old. She would not see her mother again for years. The photographs from this period exist too. They show a small, careful, watchful girl. In 1940, almost immediately after marrying Olivier, Vivien Leigh became pregnant for the second time. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The loss devastated her in a way that Suzanne's birth had not. A difference she did not consciously process, but that her behavior made visible. She had wanted, desperately, a child with Olivier. She had not particularly wanted a child with Leigh Holman. The miscarriage was the first signal. Quiet, unattended, easy to overlook in the noise of wartime celebrity. That something inside Vivien was beginning to operate erratically. Friends noticed mood swings, brief euphorias followed by black, immovable depressions, inability to sleep for nights at a stretch, followed by collapses that lasted days. She kept working. She kept the public face intact. But the mechanism that would, 15 years later, dismantle her in front of a film crew on a soundstage in Sri Lanka, that mechanism was already running. And in Vancouver, a 7-year-old girl was writing letters to her mother and receiving back the cordial, distracted reply said of a woman who had moved on to a life that did not contain her. In 1941, with the war intensifying, Vivien Leigh made one trip to Canada to visit her daughter. She stayed briefly. She was photographed by the local press. She left. And in the days that followed her departure, the Mother Superior of Suzanne's convent school summoned the child into her office. There had been newspapers. There had been articles. There had been a question that the convent could no longer overlook. What that Mother Superior said next would alter the next 5 years of Suzanne Holman's life. And it would teach a 7-year-old something about her mother's choices that no child should have to learn. Vancouver, in the early years of the war, was the destination of choice for the children of the British upper classes, whose parents could afford to evacuate them out of bombing range. Suzanne arrived with her grandmother, Gertrude Hartley, a woman who, for all her own complicated relationship with her famous daughter, became the most consistent figure in Suzanne's life. They settled into the rhythms of a wartime expatriate existence. Convent school, careful daily routines, letters home to Leigh Holman in England that arrived weeks late and were treasured all the same. Suzanne was a quiet, intelligent child. Her teachers noted her composure. Her grandmother noted her resilience. Her father, in his letters, noted that she seemed to be managing the disruptions of the war with a steadiness that almost worried him. Children, he understood, were not supposed to be this composed. The convent in Vancouver was run by Catholic nuns of the same order that had taught Vivien at Roehampton 30 years earlier. There was a continuity in this that the family had found reassuring when they made the arrangements. The girl would be educated within the tradition her mother had been educated within. The faith would be maintained. The structure would hold. Then her mother visited. Vivien arrived in Vancouver in 1941 with the entourage that accompanied her wherever she travelled by this point. Assistants, press, the apparatus of mid-war celebrity. She saw Suzanne. She was photographed. The Canadian newspapers ran the photographs. And by the time Vivien had departed, and the journalists had filed their stories, the Mother Superior of the convent had read enough to make a decision that her religion required her to make. Suzanne Holman was the child of divorced parents. Her mother had remarried. The Catholic Church, in 1941, did not recognize either of these realities. The Mother Superior summoned Suzanne to her office. The conversation that followed was brief, formal, and devastating in the precise way that institutional rejections are devastating to children who have done nothing to earn them. The convent, she explained, could no longer house Suzanne. The publicity surrounding her mother's situation made it impossible. The girl would need to be transferred to a day school. She would not be welcome to return. Suzanne was 7 years old. She had not eloped with anyone. She had not divorced anyone. She had not chosen her mother or her mother's actions, or newspaper turns those actions into the kind of public spectacle that small Catholic institutions in 1941 could not absorb without consequence. But she was, in the moral arithmetic of the convent, the inheritor of her mother's transgressions. She left the school she had been told would be her home for the duration of the war. Her grandmother Gertrude, who took the news with the steady fury of a woman who had been managing her daughter's consequences for decades, found a new arrangement. Suzanne was transferred to a day school. Later, the family moved to Banff, where she lived in the mountains and skied to school in the winter. Photographs from this period show her in heavy wool coats, smaller than the snow around her, looking at the camera with the eyes of someone who has been quietly recalibrating her expectations of the adult world. In December 1942, David O. Selznick, the same producer who had made her mother famous, proposed casting Suzanne as the young Jane in Orson Welles' adaptation of Jane Eyre. He was specific about his reasoning. The girl's Canadian accent, he wrote in an internal memo, probably will be greatly in her favour. The publicity potential, of course, was enormous. Leigh Holman refused. It is one of the few moments in the documented record of Suzanne's childhood where her father exercises an absolute, unmovable veto. Whatever else he was willing to negotiate with the mother of his child. And he negotiated a great deal, with consistent patience and dignity. He was not willing to negotiate this. His daughter would not be put on screen. She would not be marketed. She would not become the small companion piece to her mother's career. He had watched what Hollywood had done to Vivien. He was not going to allow it to begin doing the same thing to Suzanne. Suzanne never appeared in Jane Eyre. She never appeared in any film. She never trained, in any sustained way, for the career that her mother and her famous producer had briefly imagined for her. And by the time she returned to England after the war, she had already absorbed, at a deep structural level, The lesson that the spotlight her mother lived inside was not a place she was permitted, or, increasingly, willing to enter. When the war ended, Suzanne returned to England. She was 12 years old. She had lived in 3 countries on 2 continents. She had been moved between schools, religions, and family structures, with the calm adaptability of a child who has learned that adult arrangements are subject to revision without notice. Her father met her at the dock. Her grandmother had travelled with her every step of the way. Her mother sent a note. What followed across the next decade of Suzanne's adolescence was a sustained exercise in not quite presence. Vivien was alive. Vivien was in England. Vivien was, by reputation, the most beautiful woman in the country, and by performance record, one of the great actresses of her generation. And Vivien was, in any practical sense, somewhere else. Suzanne attended Sherborne School for Girls. She was sent to a finishing school at Vaud in Switzerland. She enrolled briefly at RADA, her mother's old training ground, before quietly leaving and taking a position as an instructress at her grandmother's Academy of Beauty Culture in Knightsbridge. She was building a life that did not require her mother in order to function. This was deliberate. From Switzerland, she wrote her mother letters, long ones. The kind a girl in her late teens writes when she is trying to construct a relationship out of paper, because the physical one is not available. In one letter, she told Vivien she was simply aching to see her, also for a chat. Vivien forwarded the letters to Lee Holman. In her cover note, she described them as so sweet and funny. The casualness of that response, passed along like an amusing anecdote rather than the urgent communication it actually was, is one of the small, quiet documents of cruelty that emerges from the Vivien Leigh archive when researchers go looking for it. Suzanne did not know at the time what her mother had done with her letters. She would learn it, later, the way she learned most things about Vivien. Indirectly, through papers, through the recollections of other people, through the slow process of assembling as a portrait of someone who would not sit for one. Friends who knew both were women during these years would later note a specific pattern. Vivien remembered the birthdays of every member of every theatrical company she had ever worked with. Cards arrived. Flowers arrived. The performance of attentiveness was meticulous. She forgot her daughter's birthday with some regularity. The biographer Hugo Vickers, who would later become the only writer Suzanne trusted with the family papers, would record this asymmetry without comment. It did not need commentary. The fact of it was its own indictment. Suzanne, by her late teens, had stopped expecting otherwise. She had built, around the absence, a structure that could function regardless of whether her mother was inside it or not. The structure had a name, her father, her grandmother, Daisy, the French maid who had been with her since infancy, the small, durable architecture of the people who showed up. Vivien during these years was not coasting on fame. She was disintegrating, slowly, in the specific way that undiagnosed bipolar disorder disintegrates a person across the decades before the diagnosis exists. The euphoric phases produced extraordinary work. Her performances on stage with Olivier, the Cleopatra plays, the A Streetcar Named Desire that won her a second Oscar in 1951. The depressive phases produced collapses, hospitalizations, and behaviors that her husband documented in private letters with a horror that grew more articulate as the years progressed. A second miscarriage in 1944 deepened the pattern. She had wanted, desperately, a child with Olivier. The pregnancy ended at 4 months. A fall on set during a production of Caesar and Cleopatra, the loss attributed at the time to the accident. She was hospitalized. She emerged altered. The Vivien Leigh that Suzanne occasionally saw across the 1940s and 1950s was not the woman in the photographs. She was a person being progressively reorganized by an illness no one yet knew how to name, married to a man whose patience was being exhausted by the daily reality of living with someone whose interior weather had become impossible to predict. Suzanne, watching from the careful distance she had constructed, said nothing publicly. She would say nothing publicly for the rest of her life. In 1953, on a soundstage in Sri Lanka, Vivien Leigh broke, not metaphorically, visibly. In front of a film crew, a director, and several of her co-stars, the breakdown was so complete that the production had to be shut down and a private aircraft chartered to fly her, restrained, back to England. What happened on that set is the next part of this story. The film was called Elephant Walk. It was a 1953 Paramount production set on a tea plantation in Ceylon's modern-day Sri Lanka, with Vivien Leigh in the lead role and a young Australian actor named Peter Finch playing her love interest. Olivier had wanted the part. The studio had wanted Finch. The decision had been a small humiliation that Olivier absorbed with the public grace he had perfected, and the private resentment that was beginning to corrode his marriage from the inside. Vivien and Finch began an affair almost immediately upon arrival on location. This was not, in itself, unusual for Vivien at this point in her life. Her infidelities had been a documented feature of the marriage for years, and Olivier's had matched them. What was unusual was the speed and visibility of the Finch affair, and what it revealed about the state of Vivien's mind by the time filming began. She was not sleeping. She was talking to people who were not in the room. She was reciting at length lines from A Streetcar Named Desire, a folk she had filmed 2 years earlier, and that, by the testimony of multiple witnesses, she was beginning to inhabit at the boundary between performance and identity. The breakdown was rapid. The shooting schedule was disrupted. Production assistants were dispatched to manage situations that did not have a vocabulary. By the third week on location, the studio understood that Vivien Leigh could not finish the film. A private aircraft was chartered. Olivier flew to California to meet her on her return. She was sedated for the flight. When she landed, she was hospitalized at a psychiatric facility in Connecticut. Within weeks, she was transferred to the Netherton Hospital in Surrey, England. The treatment, in 1953, was electroconvulsive therapy. She underwent multiple sessions. She emerged from the hospital months later, visibly altered. The memory loss was significant. The personality, by Olivier's private testimony, was changed in ways that he was not sure were recoverable. The Vivien he had met in 1937 and the Vivien he was now married to were related. He wrote it in a letter that survived, by the slenderest thread of continuity. She was 40 years old. The studio replaced her in Elephant Walk with Elizabeth Taylor. The press coverage was managed, partially suppressed, and ultimately impossible to contain. The British public learned that Vivien Leigh had been hospitalized. The American public learned in less specific terms. The shape of the story, that the woman who had played Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche Dubois was now herself unwell in ways that defied the era's vocabulary, entered the public record, and was never fully retrieved from it. Suzanne was 19 years old when her mother was hospitalized. She was at finishing school in Switzerland. She received the news through her father, who delivered it with the careful, dignified precision he brought to every piece of difficult information he had ever transmitted to his daughter. The hospitalization was not, by this point, a surprise. Suzanne had been observing her mother's deterioration in oblique, partial, ill-explained fragments for most of her adolescence. What she had not yet had to absorb was the public version of it. She would absorb that, now, repeatedly, for the next 60 years of her life. Every time a new biography appeared, every time a newspaper revisited the story, every time some interviewer at a cocktail party leaned in and asked, with the eager curiosity of strangers, whether she had any thoughts on her mother's famous illness. Her standard response, perfected over decades, was a brief, polite smile and a change of subject. In 1956, Vivien became pregnant for the third time. She was 42 years old. The pregnancy was, by every account she gave at the time, the thing she had been waiting for through 15 years of marriage to Olivier. A child of their own. A repair of what could not otherwise be repaired. She announced the pregnancy publicly. The press celebrated. Olivier, for the duration of those weeks, performed the role of attentive, expectant father with a sincerity that surprised even him. She lost the baby at 4 months. The miscarriage occurred in the summer of 1956. Vivien was performing in a London production of Noël Caussand's South Sea Bubble at the time. She finished the run with the professionalism that had always defined her. And then she collapsed into a depressive episode that did not lift for nearly a year. This was, by the private assessment of her doctors, the loss that finished her. Not finished her artistically. She would work again, including the late performances in Look After Lulu and Jewel of Angels that observers found extraordinary, but finished her in the structural sense. The marriage to Olivier, which had been held together by accumulated love, accumulated guilt, and accumulated hope for a shared child, lost its last load-bearing wall in 1956. By 1958, Olivier had begun the affair with Joan Plowright that would, 2 years later, end the marriage entirely. Vivien was watching the dissolutions from inside an illness that had no name yet, and a body that had failed her at the only task she had wanted it to perform. Suzanne, by this point, was 23 years old, engaged to be married, building the quiet life in Wiltshire that would be her chosen alternative to her mother's existence. The miscarriage of 1956 was, in the strange arithmetic of family histories, the closest Suzanne came to having a sibling. The child would have been her half-brother or half-sister. Whatever grief Suzanne carried about this, the small, complicated grief of someone who's lost a person she never met, was added to the larger inventory of unspoken material that she carried about her mother. She managed it the way she managed everything. Privately, without complaint, and without sharing it with people who had not earned the right to hear it. The end of the Olivier marriage played out in the British press across 1959 and 1960, with the slow inevitability of an avalanche. Joan Plowright was the other woman. Olivier had met her on the production of John Osborne's The Entertainer. She was younger than Vivien, calmer than Vivien, and free of the catastrophic mood swings that had become, by this point, the central organizing fact of Vivien's daily life. She was, in the language of contemporary observers, what Olivier needed. The implication that Vivien was what Olivier no longer needed was not stated. It did not need to be. The divorce was finalized in 1960. Vivien gave a brief, gracious public statement. She did not contest the proceedings. She accepted, with the surface composure she had spent her entire adult life perfecting, the public dissolution of the marriage that had organized her existence for 2 decades. In private, she did not accept it. Letters from this period, later released, document a woman moving through a landscape of grief, fury, and disbelief that her illness amplified into something close to madness. She wrote to Olivier. She wrote at him. She wrote, in some weeks, daily, letters that her husband, by this point exhausted, often did not answer. The relationship for him was over. For her, it would never be over. Suzanne was a married woman by this point. She had married Robin Farrington, a handsome Lloyd's underwriter, on December 6, 1957. The wedding had coincided with the early visible cracks in the Olivier marriage. Olivier had attended. He had stood in the photographs from that day, somewhat in the background. Vivien had been present. The strain on her face was visible to people who knew how to read it. The young couple settled into a life divided between London and Wiltshire. Suzanne was 24 years old. She was the kind of bride who, for the first time in her life, had organized an event that placed her, not her mother, at the center of the photographs. She had her own home. She had her own husband. She was building, deliberately, a life with edges and structure, and the small, unglamorous solidity that had been entirely missing from her childhood. She was, in the most precise sense, escaping. After the divorce, Vivien Leigh entered the strange final chapter of her life. She moved into a flat in Eaton Square. She maintained, with the discipline that never deserted her, a public face. She continued working. Duel of Angels in 1958, Toverich on Broadway in 1963, the role for which she won a Tony Award, and the performance that would be her last on the New York stage. She travelled. She was photographed. She was, until close inspection, the Vivien Leigh the world expected. She had also, by this point, begun the relationship with the actor Jack Merivale that would be the last romantic relationship of her life. Merivale was kind, Merivale was steady. Merivale was, in the specific configuration of his personality, the male presence that Vivien had needed for years and had refused to recognize because his name was not Laurence Olivier. He was with her, on and off, for the 7 years between the divorce and her death. He visited Suzanne after Vivien was gone. He maintained the relationship with Suzanne for the rest of his life. He treated her, in the small, ordinary, day-to-day ways that her mother had not been able to manage, like family. Suzanne, by the early 1960s, had her first son, then her second, then her third. She was building, in Wiltshire, the family that her own childhood had not provided. She visited her mother. She maintained the relationship. She did not speak about it publicly. She did not allow her sons to be photographed at events involving Vivien Leigh. She protected the perimeter of her ordinary life with the same quiet, unshakable will that her mother had used to construct her stardom, and that her father, Lee Holman, had used to refuse Selznick in 1942. She had inherited her mother's beauty in unexpected places, but she had inherited her father's will entirely. Her grandmother Gertrude, still living, was a regular presence in the lives of Suzanne's sons. Daisy Zagougal, the French maid, was still in the family circle. The people who had actually raised Suzanne were the people who got to know her children. Vivien, the famous mother, was a peripheral, intermittent figure, adored when she was present, missed less than she might have hoped when she was not. This was the betrayal, in the end, not the press version, not the dramatic version. Vivien Leigh had not been there when it mattered, and by the time she finally turned, in her last years with something approaching sustained attention, toward the daughter she had spent decades barely seeing, the structure of Suzanne's life had been built without her. In the summer of 1967, Vivien Leigh was rehearsing for a play she would never perform. She had been diagnosed again with the tuberculosis that had first appeared a decade earlier. She had been told repeatedly by her doctors to rest. She had refused, with the same will she had refused everything else that asked her to slow down or stop being who she had spent her life becoming. On a hot July night in her Eaton Square flat, alone except for a sleeping Jack Merivale who had stepped out briefly with the dog, she collapsed for the final time. She was 53 years old. Vivien Leigh died on July 7, 1967. The cause was tuberculosis, the disease that had first surfaced in her body in 1945, and that she had managed through every kind of denial and refusal for the next 22 years. She was found alone in her flat. Jack Merivale had stepped out to walk the dog. When he returned, she was on the floor, no longer breathing. The death certificate listed the medical cause. It did not list the contributing factors. The decades of cigarette smoking, the years of bipolar episodes managed without modern medication, the exhaustion of a body that had been asked to perform at impossible levels for too long. She was 53. The news reached Suzanne in Wiltshire. She received it the way she had received every other piece of news about her mother across her life. With composure, in private, without making it the subject of public discussion. She travelled to London. She made the arrangements. She buried her mother. The funeral was small. The memorial service that followed was not. The theatrical community gathered to mourn a woman they had loved more easily than her own family had been able to. The tributes were extensive, the obituaries lavish, the photographs of Suzanne in mourning published and republished across the world's newspapers. She gave no interviews. She accepted the inheritance. Vivien had left most of her estate to Suzanne, a final, practical gesture from a mother who had not been good at the daily ones. The estate included the flat, the personal papers, the letters between Vivien and Olivier, the diaries her grandmother Gertrude had kept across decades, and the photographs of a life that had been more documented than almost any other woman's life in the 20th century. Suzanne took possession of all of it, and then, with the same instinct that had governed her relationship with her mother since childhood, she put most of it away. What followed, across the 48 years between her mother's death in 1967 and her own death in 2015, was one of the most successful exercises in dignified privacy that any child of a major celebrity has ever achieved. Suzanne Farrington did not write a memoir. She did not give the long-form interview about her mother that publishers offered her, repeatedly, across decades. She did not appear in the documentaries. She did not authorize the dramatic projects. She did not. And this is the detail that distinguishes her absolutely from the more famous celebrity children of a generation. Write the mommy dearest equivalent that she would have been entitled to write, and that the market would have rewarded enormously. She had material. She had every right to share it. She chose instead to share none of it. When biographers approached her, she vetted them with patience and skepticism. The biographer who finally earned her trust was Hugo Vickers, whose 1988 book, Vivien Leigh, she described quietly to friends as the only one I can read without embarrassment. She gave him access. She gave him her grandmother's diaries. She accompanied him, in some cases, to interviews with her mother's old friends. She did not, even with Vickers, sit for the full interview that would have generated headlines. She raised her sons, Neville the eldest, born in 1958, then Tim, then Jonathan. 3 boys, raised in Wiltshire, in a household defined by the things that her own childhood had lacked: predictability, presence, the daily rituals of a parent who does not disappear. She was a good mother. The evidence for this comes not from her own statements. She did not make statements, but from the lives of her children, who grew up apparently undamaged, who built their own families, who produced the 12 grandchildren that her obituary would later mention as the central facts of her surviving legacy. Robin Farrington, her husband, was steady in the specific way her father had been. He worked at Lloyd's. They divided their time between London and Wiltshire. They travelled when they wanted to. They played tennis. They skied. They played bridge with friends. They did all the things that the daughter of Vivien Leigh would have been forgiven for finding too small, too unglamorous, too modest, and Suzanne, instead, recognised as exactly the life she had wanted. From the moment she was old enough to understand that the alternative existed. Robin died in 2002. They had been married for 45 years. Suzanne lived another 13 years as a widow, in the same house in Lower Zeals, surrounded by the same friends, maintaining the same disciplined privacy. She watched a steady stream of books about her mother appear and did not respond to any of them. She watched documentaries she did not authorize. She watched her mother's face used to sell perfume, posters, and tribute calendars. She said nothing. In 2013, 2 years before her own death, Suzanne Farrington made one final decisive gesture toward her mother's legacy. She sold the Vivien Leigh archive to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The archive was substantial. Thousands of letters, including the correspondence with Olivier, photographs spanning every phase of Vivien's life, personal papers, scripts, contracts, the working materials of a major theatrical career. It had sat since 1967 in Suzanne's custody. She had protected it for 46 years. She had refused requests to publish it, to exhibit it, to monetize it in any of the ways the market would have welcomed. And then, at age 79, she sold it to the V&A. The sale was not primarily about money. The V&A is a public museum. The archive's transfer made the materials available, in due course, to scholars, biographers, and the public, exactly the audience Suzanne had spent decades keeping the materials away from. The gesture was deliberate. She had decided, in the last years of her life, that her mother's papers belonged to history rather than to family. She had decided that the era in which she could plausibly protect Vivien from the public, and protect herself, in the process, from the relentless interest in being Vivien's daughter, was ending. She made the arrangements. She signed the papers. She handed over the boxes. Then she went home to Wiltshire and continued the life she had been quietly perfecting for half a century. Tennis, bridge, her sons, her grandchildren, her many friends, the slow garden, the long English afternoons. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her mother by 46 years. She had outlived her father by more than 4 decades. She had outlived almost every member of her mother's theatrical generation, and she had done it all without writing a single line about any of them. The privacy was its own monument. Suzanne Farrington died on March 1, 2015, in Lower Zeals, Wiltshire. She was 81 years old. The cause was not specified publicly. The obituary mentioned only that she had died at home, surrounded by her family. The Telegraph's announcement described a life of love and laughter. It mentioned her 3 sons. It mentioned her 12 grandchildren. It mentioned her many friends. It did not mention her mother in the first sentence. This, in itself, was a victory. For most of Suzanne Farrington's life, every public reference to her had begun with the words, "daughter of Vivien Leigh." The obituary writers, at the end, gave her the dignity of being introduced as herself first. Wife, mother, grandmother, before the inevitable acknowledgement that she had also incidentally been the only child of one of the most famous women of the 20th century. She was buried quietly. The funeral was attended by her family, her close friends, and almost no journalists. There were no television cameras. There were no photographers stationed at the church gate. The protective perimeter she had spent her life maintaining held, one final time, on the day she crossed it. In the days that followed, the obituaries appeared. They were generous, careful, and, for those who had known her, accurate. The longer pieces in the British press inevitably returned to Vivien. They had to. The relationship was the story, whether Suzanne had wanted it to be or not. But the relationship, by 2015, was no longer the entire story. Suzanne had built something else. In the long years between her mother's death and her own, she had built a life that was hers. Not Vivien's leftover, not Vivien's tribute, not Vivien's monument. Hers. That was the answer to the question Vivien's biographers had been asking for decades. Who was Suzanne, really? She was the daughter who chose herself. Vivien Leigh had one daughter who survived, 2 pregnancies that did not, and a small network of descendants who carried pieces of her story forward in ways the public rarely connected to her name. Suzanne's 3 sons inherited, in the most literal sense, the Vivien Leigh estate that their mother had inherited and protected. They received the funds from the V&A sale. They received, eventually, the surviving family possessions. They received the responsibility, going forward, of being the great-grandsons of Gertrude Hartley, the grandsons of Vivien Leigh, and the sons of Suzanne Farrington. 3 generations of women whose lives had been organized by the gravitational pull of a single dazzling, devastating star at the center of the family. They have been, on the available public record, as private as their mother was. Neville Farrington, the eldest, has rarely given interviews. Tim and Jonathan have been similarly invisible to the press. The 12 great-grandchildren, Vivien Leigh's great-grandchildren, though almost no one ever frames them that way, are scattered across England, leading lives that the family has carefully kept disconnected from the entertainment machinery that consumed their great-grandmother. This is, by any honest reading, an extraordinary piece of generational work. The descendants of major celebrities almost never manage this. The pull of access, money, attention, and revisionist storytelling tends to draw at least one inheritor into the public conversation about the famous ancestor. The Farrington family has produced none. Whatever they think of Vivien, and they presumably think a great deal, they have agreed collectively that the thinking is theirs. This was Suzanne's final achievement, and it required her entire lifetime to accomplish. She ensured that the story of being Vivien Leigh's blood relative would, after her death, recede rather than accelerate. She trained her children, by example, in the art of not being defined by the person whose face appeared on the wall in the next room. They learned the lesson. The medical context of Vivien Leigh's illness deserves, finally, an honest acknowledgement. Vivien suffered from what we now call bipolar disorder type I, the most severe form of the illness, characterized by sustained manic and depressive episodes that, in her case, were occasionally psychotic. The illness was not properly identified during her lifetime. The treatments she received, multiple courses of electroconvulsive therapy, the strong sedatives of the 1950s, the casual prescriptions of medications that interacted dangerously with her drinking, were the best the era could offer and were, by modern standards, traumatic interventions that compounded the underlying condition. She was diagnosed, repeatedly, with what doctors then called manic depression. She was hospitalized at various points in at least 4 facilities. She received approximately 12 courses of ECT across the final 15 years of her life. The memory loss from this volume of ECT was significant and documented. Friends who knew her in the 1940s and friends who knew her in the 1960s often described, when interviewed, 2 related but distinct people. The miscarriages, 2 confirmed, possibly more, compounded the mood disturbances in ways that contemporary medicine now understands as common in bipolar women. Pregnancy and pregnancy loss are well-documented triggers for severe mood episodes in patients with the underlying condition. Vivien did not have access to the modern understanding of any of this. Lithium, the medication that would, beginning in the late 1960s, transform the treatment of bipolar disorder, became widely available too late to help her. Had she been born 30 years later, she would have been diagnosed in her 20s, medicated within months, and stabilized within a year. She would, in all probability, have lived into her 80s. She would, in all probability, have been a better mother to Suzanne than she was able to be. This is not an excuse for the documented choices. It is a context for them. The woman who forwarded her daughter pleading letters to her ex-husband and called them sweet and funny was a woman whose interior weather had been deformed, since at least the early 1940s, by an illness she did not understand and could not name. The final truth about Vivien Leigh is not the face in the photographs, not Scarlett O'Hara, not the 2 Academy Awards. Not the great love affair with Olivier that the world has, for 90 years, romanticized into something closer to a fairy tale than a tragedy. Not the spectacular performances of Blanche de Beauvoir on stage and screen, that won her the second Oscar and that drew, with unsettling precision, from the disintegration she was already living through in her own life. The final truth is this. A young woman who had been raised, from the age of 6, alone in a convent in Roehampton, married a kind man at 19, and gave birth to a daughter she had not entirely chosen. She left that daughter to pursue the career she had selected for herself when she was a child. She built one of the largest stardoms of the 20th century on a foundation that did not include the small girl in Vancouver, or in Switzerland, or in Wiltshire, who was writing letters and waiting for replies that did not come. Her daughter, raised by a steady father and a steady grandmother, and the steady, irreplaceable French maid named Daisy Gogol, grew up without bitterness, without spectacle, and without the public expression of grief that her circumstances would have entitled her to. She inherited her mother's archive. She inherited her mother's fortune. She inherited the surname her mother had abandoned for the stage. And she did, with all of it, what her mother had never been able to do for her. She protected. She protected her own children from what had been done to her. She protected her mother's legacy from the worst forms of public consumption. She protected, finally, the silence that her mother, even in her best moments, had never quite learned to give her. That silence was the secret fate. That silence was the gift. We began with a child writing letters from Switzerland, asking for a meeting, asking only for a chat. We end 48 years after her mother's death, with that same child, now 81 years old, surrounded by her 3 sons, her 12 grandchildren, and her many friends, dying in the quiet Wiltshire village she had chosen, deliberately, as the opposite of everywhere her mother had ever lived. What Suzanne Farrington's life demands of us is the recognition that the children of famous parents are not their inheritance. They are their own. And the most radical act a celebrity's child can perform is the one Suzanne performed quietly across 50 years. She refused to be the story. Next time, we tell the story of another legendary Hollywood beauty whose only child was hidden from the public for the first 15 years of her life, and whose biological identity, when it finally emerged in a 1958 magazine article, sent shockwaves through the studio system and ended the career of one of the most powerful actresses in cinema. The child grew up not knowing who her mother was. The mother went to her grave refusing to acknowledge what she had done. You know the actress, you don't know the child. If Suzanne Farrington's story stayed with you, subscribe. These are the histories that don't make highlight reels. They are worth knowing completely.